well, it's not all the results. It's 141 countries. They can't put them all up here because the font size would be, 0.01 or something. This is the top 10, though, and Hong Kong is number 1. Hong Kong has been number 1 since we've been doing the project. If any other country but Hong Kong had come out first, we would have had to scrap the project, because everybody knows Hong Kong is the freest economy on Earth. Milton Friedman taught us that. I mean, I think, if nothing else. That doesn't mean it's Gulch. It's not the freest place I can imagine, but it's certainly the freest place, I think, that exists on Earth. In Hong Kong, taxes are about as low as they are anywhere on Earth. There are no tariffs and quotas. The money supply and inflation situation is as stable as pretty much anywhere on Earth. They have a very high-functioning legal system. I'd much rather be in a Hong Kong court at the mercy of a Hong Kong judge than an Alabama judge, you can be sure, and so forth. Singapore is number 2. Singapore is a very weird country because although it scores very well on our index, and I'm comfortable with this. I've thought long and hard about Singapore's situation from a purely narrow economic sense, and we're being very narrow in our conception here of economic freedom. We're just thinking pretty much about truck bartering and exchanging kind of stuff. Singapore is a very free market economy. It's obviously not a political democracy of high renown, or nor does it respect civil liberties in a great degree. So Singapore is unusual in that it has a high degree of economic liberty, but a fairly low degree of political and civil liberty. Most of the other countries you'll see, in fact all of the other countries you'll see on this list, are both liberal democracies with a fairly high regard for civil liberties and also free-ish, I don't want to say free market, but they're more free market economies. Chile, of course, has had an interesting history, but today Chile scores very well on the various measures of civil liberties and political democracy. Of course, that wasn't the case not too long ago, but today that certainly is. Okay. So there is a correlation between economic liberty and political and civil liberties. It's not a perfect one. You have interesting cases like Singapore, for example, and I've actually got some research I'm doing on the side about that question. Okay. Just to highlight, this is a few other selected countries of sort of interest. I didn't put Azerbaijan on here because I very rarely encounter anyone who cares a lot about Azerbaijan, but you'll see Germany and Taiwan and Japan and so forth up there. Sweden comes in 33rd. One of the things I've learned after having studied economic freedom around the world for the last 20 years is that the differences between Sweden and the United States pale in comparison to the differences between Sweden and the United States and, let's say, Nigeria. I used to really think it was a great, interesting debate to talk about how Sweden does it this way, and should we do it their way. I no longer find that to be an interesting debate because Sweden does almost everything the same way we do things. Oh yeah, their taxes are a little higher. But other than that, the structure of the Swedish economy is a market economy. Property is primarily private. They primarily have free trade. They've got stable money and prices. The regulatory regime, except for labor markets, is probably better than the United States. Now, the United States has lower taxes and probably better, more free labor markets, but Sweden and the United States are structurally similar economies. And that's one of the reasons why the Swedes are relatively rich like we are. The real important, I think, fundamental differences are what do you go to a place like Nigeria where the government planner, the bureaucrat, is in charge of everything about daily life. There is simply nothing you can do in life that doesn't require a piece of paper or 10 pieces of paper to get done. In Sweden, you can carry out your life. Yeah, you're going to pay a lot of taxes in Sweden, but you can carry out your daily life. Days can go by without a lot of direct contact with government officials. And that's kind of what a free market's about. Going about your life without a lot of contact with the government. Swedes do that, except on tax day where they send over half their money to the government, right? Nigerians don't go from here till lunch or till dinner, already lunch, so here to dinner without encountering somebody or another, some officious person who wants to see their paper for this or for that. Okay, that's the big differences in the world that I think are more interesting to study. So anyway, Sweden scores very high. They're not Hong Kong and and Singapore are high, but they're in the top, they're 33rd out of 141. I think that's where they belong. I get a lot of questions about China. China still scores very low. They're below the halfway point. But you got to realize China is a country of over 1 billion people. About 300 million of them live in free market, free-ish marketplaces like Shanghai. But about 800 million live in communist China still. And if you sort of do a weighted average, we only give one number per country. If you sort of weight that, China still is most of the people who live in China. If you were a random person picked out of China, you're probably living in a very tightly controlled, essentially communist environment. It hasn't changed much since the 70s or 80s. Right? Again, if you're lucky to live in Shanghai, you're probably as free as anyone on earth, as far as economics is concerned. Venezuela is a disaster. We actually have data going back to 1970. We were able to backdate the numbers. We didn't start doing this till the 90s, but we have numbers back to 1970. Venezuela was in the top 20 in 1970. In 1970, Venezuela would have been considered the most liberal in terms of politics, the most liberal democracy, the most civil liberty, one of the next to Argentina, I think the second richest country in South America, maybe by 1970 even richer than Argentina. High-functioning market economy. I mean, by Latin American standards in 1970, Venezuela was the garden spot of Latin America. Today, not so much. In fact, economic growth in Venezuela has been -1% per year for the last 20 years. That's compounding, -1% every year for 20 years in a row. Kind of like the Dow Jones right now, right? Every year it's a little lower, right? Well, this is Venezuela's experience for 20 years, for a whole generation. And Venezuelans today are 25% poorer or something than they were a generation ago. So it's a real tragedy. And of course, Zimbabwe. And again, that's a tragedy too, because if you go back in time, Zimbabwe would have been a relatively high-functioning African country. Botswana is not on the list, but Botswana and South Africa are currently the highest-rated African countries. They're in the 40s, I think. Zimbabwe would have been in the middle of the pack in the whole world, one of the highest-functioning places. You know, 1980, it's just fallen apart, as you all probably know. I have not memorized all 141 countries, but if you have a specific country you're interested in, I can take a stab at it. But in lieu of that, I do have a color map, which gives you just with an eyeball glance, sort of an idea of where the movers and shakers are. Blue is good. Green is sort of upper middle. Yellow and orange is lower middle, and red is bad. We're old-fashioned. We think red. That's communism, right? Red is bad. Yes, sir.
Maybe you're reading the map wrong, but I think you have Georgia is in the red.
That's Azerbaijan. Georgia's in blue.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, Georgia is that right there.
Okay, I got two mixed up.
Yeah, that's Azerbaijan, and you can't really discern. Armenia is too small, but Armenia is like green. I was going to mention Georgia. In fact, Georgia is the World Bank's doing business project rates Georgia, the country of Georgia. I always be careful when I say that Georgia and Alabama, they all think I'm talking about sort of state. Go Dogs or something. The country of Georgia it was rated by the Doing Business Project as the most fast reforming country, and we actually have them in our index. Similarly, they've come up the fastest in the last few years. I've been to Georgia 3 times. In fact, I was there during the war in August. Thank you very much. My wife was not pleased. The Russian tanks were about 20 miles from where I was.